Well, good evening. This is Stephen doing our last screencast for the term about production decisions. And yes, you're welcome to ask the squirrel to inquire of Buddha exactly what you should produce. And while I certainly think intuition is important, I wouldn't rely on it solely. So this screencast, we're going to talk a little bit about a little review of marginal analysis, talk briefly about non-convex production curves, a little bit about discrete decisions, path dependence, and a case of produce or don't produce. In our last screencast, we looked at marginal analysis, which looks at the next unit of production and seeks to decide if it's actually worth doing. General outcome of that is this idea here, which is marginal cost equals marginal benefit is the optimum production point. Here we see it expressed in terms of total cost, total benefit. And what we learned was that at the point of parallel tangency between these two lines, we find a production level which has the maximum benefit, and therefore a outstanding point of production to choose. One where the marginal cost equals the marginal revenue, which is the price, which is also the marginal benefit. So this string of equalities is one way to approach optimal production decisions. And throughout the last several screencasts, we've seen three basic behavioral possibilities emerging. We saw it in our discussion of elasticity. We saw it in our discussion of economies of scale, and also in the marginal returns. So we had, in each case, we had increasing, constant, or decreasing. And this is a case from the book about Iris's Cafe. She opens at 11 a.m. and closes it in the afternoon, I believe, at 5, and she's considering staying open into the late night hours. What she's aware of is that there's a student demand for late night snacks, essentially, and based on her starting point, marginal analysis, that is looking at the next unit of production, would tell her, yes, she should be open longer because there's an increasing return on revenue. If she were to look in the other direction and consider being less hours, so she would see a decreasing return on that direction. So it becomes clear to her, using this heuristic approach of marginal analysis, that staying open longer is a good idea. Now, unfortunately, this is actually a failure of marginal analysis due to the fact that there are multiple equilibria in her production curve. So this has resulted in her finding a local equilibria because of the continuous nature of the marginal analysis inquiry. Discrete decision analysis would look at multiple intervals in which she could consider the possibilities, and in doing that through the total range of possibilities, then it is likely that she would have found actually the global maximum and come to realize that she could close in the afternoon and maximize her profits. Discrete decision making has to do with looking at options, so a number of different choices, evaluating each one separately, whereas the decision that we saw in Iris's case was making a decision along a smooth curve about which direction to go. Typically, discrete decision-making is a sort of a no-go or go circumstance, possibly picking one of several enumerated choices. We also see discrete decisions in working with step functions, where we would be encouraged to pick a distinct quantity rather than reaching out to say, produce as many as possible, or in Iris's case to say, I'll just stay open as long as there's someone here that wants to spend money. By breaking the complex number of options down into discrete pieces, it allows us to make a decision about each one, evaluate each one against the next, and come up with what we can consider to be the best choice. So, the evolution of all of the crazy complex technology that surrounds us tends to show a principle of path dependence, which is to say, things have evolved have been enabled by adjacent technologies, that is, technologies that were available at the time and were within the reach of the individuals to grasp them and pull them into their system. A similar thing occurs with business ideation, and which is one of the reasons that incubators works really well, is if you're working on a business idea and you're chatting with other folks and they've got an idea, you can take some of that idea and use it in yours. So path dependence also describes a history of technology evolution, and the reason I have this old keyboard here as a picture is the Dvorak keyboard was developed in the 30s versus the QWERTY keyboard, which is what we are all familiar with, and the QWERTY keyboard was developed specifically around typing pools and mechanical typing machines. It was a keyboard layout that was difficult to use so that it prevented the mechanical jamming of the older model typewriters, whereas the Dvorak keyboard was developed to specifically be quicker for typing. However, because of the network externalities involved in the functioning of keyboards, they're obviously embedded in everything we do, to everything that we do with keyboards, so they're in our computers, deeply embedded in technology. It's become the de facto standard, and the switching cost of changing to a different keyboard layout would be it would be unmanageable, completely unmanageable. So this keyboard is an example of all three of these ideas. It didn't get used because of the path dependence of the time. It has QWERTY has stayed in place because of the network externalities, the switching costs of which are too high. And switching costs are kind of related to the transaction costs that we talked about last time. In this case, it was with respect to Sash Sunday, and she has a deal which maybe has a slightly higher than comfortable transaction costs. But before you want to reduce your transaction costs, you need to consider what's the cost of switching technologies. This is an example of an interesting discrete decision called produce or don't produce. And we're looking at this in the case of non-profitability. So when you're not making money, it might seem the first thing to do is just to quit. But there's actually a different argument in place for this, which has to do with your cost of production. So you've got some fixed costs that you're going to pay whether you're producing or not, and you've got some variable costs that are incurred based on the quantity of production. So just using this block diagram, if you choose to not produce at all, you're going to have to pay the entirety of your fixed costs, period. If you are able to produce and sell an amount that covers all of your variable cost and some portion of your fixed cost, even if it's an incomplete portion, the choice here is to produce. Any contribution to your fixed cost, as long as your variable costs are covered, is a positive event, so production is indicated. Some of the other decision tools, obviously I'm a fan of visual thinking, so visual methods to better understand the options and consequences of our choices. These become so important because we actually have a more finite mental buffer than we may believe. There's actually only about 5 to 7 places in our mind that we can hold information. This is in fact the reason telephone numbers originally were 7 digits. So visual methods allow us to see a lot more on a single page than those 5 or 7 digits that we can hold, and really what we're good at is comparing two things. We can look at an apple and an orange and compare and contrast across, but once you get to 4 or 5 or 6, we pretty much become swamped and are incapable of making rational decisions. We tend to make emotion-based decisions. So using visual methods is very powerful. We have here a fairly complex fishbone diagram. The issue at hand being a soldering defect, direction. We have a variety of components. Each one has a branch with primary and secondary decisions. We see also a fun-looking chart, and we see something that you and I might actually make on a whiteboard. And of course, even though it's buried under here, that does not mean I think it's unimportant. I am a huge advocate of mind mapping. Okay, so we're going to move on and look at a couple of other tools. They're located on this website here. Follow this trail to get to decision making, and we'll talk briefly about paired comparison analysis as well as setting up a decision criteria. This is a very powerful tool that allows you to compare one thing to another. In the case when you're lacking solid objective data, it's a subjective question at hand, and it really results in a values orientation. So developing your grid, everything is on both the horizontal and the vertical axes. You are going to gray out the ones that would result in doing the same thing twice, and you're going to fill it out in each case, making a decision between two items and the degree to which you feel this way. You can see this person filled out the entire grid, and here it is filled out. So A is the choice, 2 is the degree to which she feels that way. I recommend staying within 5 degrees of choice. If you use a 1, 2, 10, it tends to get too complex to actually be useful. So go through all the blocks, make your decisions and your degree of intensity, how strongly you feel about that decision, and then add them up and take a percentage. And what this showed is clearly C is the choice that she prefers most strongly. And this is a tool that I think of as being a decision criteria, although the MindTools website refers to it as a grid analysis. I highly recommend you take a look at this. The idea here is another grid, but it allows you to weight them. I'm running a little long, so I'm not going to go too deeply into it. It has value when you have many different factors that are difficult to differentiate, and this process will help you clarify among alternatives. And based on what the website tells you, if the results of this still don't sit quite right with you, go back and check your weightings. All right, thank you very much for your time and attention. I appreciate your efforts. I look forward to seeing you online. This is the website, incredibly powerful, highly recommend it. I know you don't have time to go there now, but bookmark it, come back to it when you're stuck.